And here's the thing, when you stop abandoning yourself in the same way, what happens is the world responds differently. They believe you, they believe your boundary, you will get less pushback. It really comes back to your core belief. Hello, my friends. Welcome back to the Maybe Mindful podcast. I'm your host, Hannah Mae, and I want to talk about something today that's been coming up a lot lately. And honestly, I've been seeing it reflected back to me in many conversations around boundaries. And boundaries is something people really struggle with and are needing clarity around. So I wanted to take a little deeper dive into this. It's this idea that when you come back to yourself, everything else organizes and less effort is required. We spend a lot of time exerting and wasting energy unnecessarily. So this is going to show up immediately in your energy levels, in your relationships with your children, in your decisions, with the ease of decisions. And most people don't know how to do this coming back to yourself, because that path is not familiar. And so boundaries as a result of this can feel really hard, because I'm going to say something radical. Boundaries are a direct result, the ease in which you can have them, of your belief system and your relationship with yourself. So there's a lot of information in this, like what we struggle with and where we feel challenged and where we really need to meet ourselves, okay? So most people think boundaries are just about saying no. And yes, there is a no in a boundary, but there's also a yes. So before we talk about the no, I want to come back to this idea of the yes. So the yes in the boundary is, as I was saying, the reflection of the relationship you have with yourself. It's about saying yes to yourself and meeting a need and really listening. So when you're deeply connected to yourself, your needs are clear. If you are disconnected, then it can feel confusing and you might not know what you need or even what you want. So when your needs are clear, like when you clearly see a need and you're connected to that, you cannot not honor the boundary. To override it would feel like a betrayal. It would feel unnatural. And it would be like standing by and watching somebody that you love, like a child, your own child, being harmed or ignored. And that would feel more difficult than to continue to ignore the need. And this is how clear it really becomes. And so it really comes back to identity and belief. So why do boundaries feel so difficult for people? Many times growing up, this is all based in conditioning per usual, and our deeper belief systems that reside in the subconscious. So the clarity is not there when those guidelines were never fully allowed or established or respected. And a lot of people don't they don't know how to respect and hear a boundary from somebody else. And so if you're somebody that really struggles putting those walls up for yourself and that creating that containment, you'll probably find that more often than not, you are attracting somebody that doesn't know how to respect them, and they require you to be more demanding in your boundary setting. And so this can be so confrontive and triggering. So here's the thing. The clarity is not there with the boundaries because we have lost connection with ourselves. When a need is not met and it's continually dismissed and avoided, there's a muting, there's a silencing of a part of yourself that has a need that is a perfectly valid need. Yet at some point along the way, we get the message that that need doesn't matter. And so we learn to dismiss it, usually in order to maintain a sense of security in our life. So whether that's so somebody doesn't get mad at us, for example, like a parent. So you're maintaining approval, for example. Over time, this muting, this continual silencing of this need and this pushing aside in order to maintain what we think we need to feel safe, loved, and cared for, we basically become disconnected from that voice, and it can feel harder to hear it, and it can sort of get lost in the haze. And this is where the disorientation and the lack of clarity really comes from, because that connection is really needing to be firmly reestablished. So it's like, for example, a child who's left to cry it out, and it's not that they're behaving better, it's that they generally become despondent if the need is not met. And that's actually really sad. And so in the process of reestablishing boundaries for ourselves, it's really important to show up with a lot of self-compassion and understanding for ourselves in this process when we understand why it feels so difficult. So at some point, self-trust was disrupted, and it starts in our relationships with our early attachments and caregivers, and then we essentially take on the role of what was modeled unconsciously. Like, of course, we don't do this consciously and intentionally, but it's what automatically happens if we don't wake up to these patterns and heal them and learn to meet ourselves and do differently, which we can do. And we can retrain our brains and we can retrain our nervous systems, which is great. But it does obviously require a little bit of effort, and it requires showing up in the discomfort. And like I said, with a good amount of self-compassion. So when this happens and there's a rupture in these relationships and with self, then you lose access to that part of yourself. You stop trusting what you feel. You stop trusting what you need. You learn to dismiss it. You brush it off. You say, no, it's not important. We're going to keep the peace. So then when you don't trust yourself, you most likely won't uphold that boundary, because there's an underlying belief there that says you don't have the right to this boundary, or it's not important. So this can manifest really negatively, obviously, if you're not having your needs met, and this can unfold and have a whole domino effect in your mental and physical health, your emotional health. But, you can become a ticking time bomb. So in relationship, for example, if you don't speak up again and again, and you act as if you're okay, and you just try and tolerate something that actually feels intolerable for your system, even when there's small things, it's like death by 1,000 cuts, and this can be a disaster waiting to happen. And it happens all the time, right? You allow, and then you're done and you blow. And oftentimes when people reach their threshold of intolerance, then they can come across as being irrational or very harsh, because it can look like, for example, the cutting off of that person, the ending of that relationship, losing your temper, being unkind, and then you're the one that pays the price. And then there's this unfortunate shame and guilt spiral that then sends you back into this cycle again. And so if a boundary is really tough, it can feel easier to ignore yourself rather than perpetually upholding them, as long as there is a conflicting underlying belief that says you don't have the right to have it. And anytime shame is present, this is one of the most insidious and lowest vibrational emotional frequencies there is, it's going to make it real tough to break that cycle unless you're coming in a different door and really meeting yourself differently, rather than just trying to strong arm yourself or be pull yourself up by your bootstraps and just hold the boundary, what's wrong with you, or just continuing to dismiss yourself. That approach is not effective, and it's not compassionate, obviously, or understanding. And again, it's still not meeting the need. It's a dismissal of the deeper need. So what most people do is they wait, right? They wait for someone to give them permission and to say it's okay to have this need, to say it's okay to say no. But the thing is the permission rarely ever comes, okay? Unless you have someone that is maybe possibly a bigger people pleaser or more empathetic than you are in that moment, and they can really see through. And I've done that with people before. I'm like, are you sure? A recovering codependent and people pleaser myself, I've definitely been able to see if somebody is actually not okay with something, and I will question them. I will say, hey, because I believe it's the considerate thing to do. But at the end of the day, if the person's giving you an answer, and this is how this can actually really affect relationships really negatively, is if somebody's saying yes to something and they really mean no, then they're gonna quite possibly really hold this against you at some point later on. And so they're doing the relationship a disservice as well. And it's ultimately not keeping the peace, which is this desired outcome that the person is wanting. And part of the reason why the permission generally never comes is because people don't like to hear no. And if you are somebody that is deeply challenged with having boundaries or people pleasing, most likely you're dealing with somebody in that situation who probably doesn't know how to take a hint. And this is where your belief about what you have the right to have and be is critical. This is where you have to become your own advocate and become disagreeable AF in order to uphold that and do so with conviction. Because some people, and I have found this myself, and these are my biggest teachers, they can be absolutely relentless. And I would say people in general are going to move to the degree that they're comfortable until you let them know otherwise. And it really isn't up to anybody else to let them know that, except for you, if it's violating you in some way. And a lot of times we also want to write off, the need and say, well, it's not technically a violation. But how do you know the boundary's been crossed? The boundary's been crossed the moment something feels not right for you. And it doesn't have to get to a 10 in order for you to be willing to uphold a boundary, nor should it. And so if you were coaching your child on this and somebody was being inappropriate with them, I think I've used this example before in another episode. When is the boundary crossed? The boundary's crossed the moment the child feels uncomfortable and they need to understand and learn that it's okay for them to step away, rather than waiting until the point where there has been a violation, it's been crossed, and then it's too late, right? And there has been harm caused. So this permission was never meant to come from outside of you. In the beginning, when we're small and our minds are developing and we're learning, it does need to come from outside of us. And so when those examples are in place, it can make all the difference. So, as a parent, to respect your kids' boundaries, and if they have a no, even if it's not really an option to have that no, to still find a way to honor it in some way, to let them know that yeah, they have the right to not want something to happen. They have the right to not like something. Oftentimes, kids do have some very vibrant and defiant no's, and the no doesn't always fly, but I think it's really important to at least acknowledge and hear. This is also life lessons in learning about just because something's uncomfortable doesn't always mean it's wrong, right? So discomfort can also be a sign of expansion and growth. And that's a whole nother conversation about really discerning where we move forward, what we push into. And it is nervous system related largely, and what we feel is safe or not. And that might be based in reality or it might not. But at the end of the day, we owe it to ourselves to hear ourselves out, right? Rather than just shutting ourselves down. Because as a kid, if that ever happened to you, it's infuriating. You see kids lose their shit and blow their tops all the time. It's important that we learn to honor our voice. So let's talk about patterns for a second that show up with this. Oftentimes you'll see this layered with people pleasing, overextending, staying in dynamics that don't feel right, the whole spectrum of something that is not the kind of relationship you want to be in, that isn't healthy to some degree, whether it's an abusive dynamic or just putting up with something that's not okay with you. Not recognizing certain behaviors as harmful because possibly they were normalized. And so that's a thing. And this can uncover abuse. This can uncover a lot of conditioning, oftentimes narcissistic conditioning, if it wasn't recognized early on. This can show up everywhere, in family, in relationships, in partnerships, in parenting, in the workplace, in our personal life, in our own personal choices that we're making, and giving ourselves permission to do something or not do something, the things that we decide to do, and making sure that they're in alignment with actually what we're really wanting versus what we think we're supposed to do. And that's a whole thing too. There's a lot of tradition through generational conditioning that can come in there, Good girls always blank. If you show up to the birthday party, you eat the birthday cake because that's polite, stuff like that, where maybe these messages were imparted to you when you were little and it just doesn't hold true for you because it doesn't align with self-care or what actually is good for you. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you're the only one that knows that. So at a certain point, we have to sort of toss all of it. We have to toss the rule book. Obviously, there's basic common courtesy and kindness, but we really do need to be able to check in with ourselves and see what is aligned. So when you start getting into this societal or generational conditioning and these traditions and these rules, this can feel really confusing, and having the right to have a boundary can feel really overwhelming, and there really has to be a deeper dive into that belief to see the origin of that belief. It can be done in a simple conversation, to be honest. And a lot of times people just don't even know the beliefs that they're walking around with. They're just operating from them automatically and unconsciously. And it's driving things and making them unhappy, where a few simple changes and adjustments could shift their whole state of being. And so when you're disconnected from your center, there is confusion generally. And when we reconnect, we reclaim clarity. And we reclaim sight and self-compassion and self-love, because to truly see yourself is to really be able to meet yourself, see the need. So like I said earlier, you can't allow certain harms to go on once you clearly see them, and once you see that you are in fact the person that is responsible for adjusting, making that change. So like I said, the work is in coming back to yourself. It's not about forcing change or overriding more, because that's just continuing the same pattern. And so if we do that to ourselves, then it's just throwing dirt into the wound. And it's really about clearing what's in the way, reconnecting with what's true, and rebuilding trust internally. And this is where we feel safe enough, once these underlying things are addressed, to be able to give ourselves permission to not only have a boundary, but to uphold it. And not only just to do so, but to do so with ease. When the belief changes, then the boundary becomes automatic and you can naturally hold it. And just as a simple exercise, you can ask yourself, would you rather honor yourself, right, if this is something you're challenged with, or continue to prioritize the feeling of somebody that is honoring themselves? They're already, if they're a boundary pusher, they're already in self-advocacy, hardcore probably. And do they need you to people please them to meet their need? And where does this belief and idea come from that you're responsible for that? Are they putting that on you, or is that coming from within? And so look at the pattern. Chances are, if this is somebody that's deeply challenging for you and you have an issue with boundaries, these are takers by nature. And that is part of how they have survived. And of course, we're going to find these relationships that are going to just most deeply challenge us. So it's subconscious, it's spiritual, it's belief-based. And we can't access that level just through thinking or analyzing. Otherwise, you would have done it already. You would have strong-armed yourself into it. We have to go deeper to the level where those beliefs were formed in order to even see what they are. So when this shifts, you stop questioning yourself. It can be so helpful to be connected with somebody else who's on this path, to get feedback from somebody who sees clearly and sanely around this, and to literally reflect back to you some of the insanity that you might be talking around what you don't feel you have the right to do, to even ask you a question, to listen, to validate for you. And here's the thing, when you stop abandoning yourself in the same way, what happens is the world responds differently. They believe you. They believe your boundary. You will get less pushback. That is because you believe, right? So it really comes back to your core belief. And this idea that when you come back to yourself, everything reorganizes, the world responds accordingly, things fall into place as they are supposed to, because you are finally standing in the place where you are meant to lead from. All right, my friends, thank you so much for tuning in. All right, my friends, thank you for tuning in. And If you enjoyed this conversation and you want to take a deeper dive into the nuance of energetic boundaries with yourself and really what you allow to flood your system, hopefully I'll stay on track and we'll cover that next week. Lots of love. Have a great week, everybody. Mwah. Bye. Kids are a great example of this, right? They will push and they will push and they will push, not because something's wrong, but because they're trying to feel out and see what holds. And we talked about this last time, where we talked about, how the kid is actually asking for a boundary. Thank you for tuning in to the Maybe Mindful podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us grow and improve. For more information, resources, and exclusive content, visit our website at maybemindful.com or go ahead and follow us over on Instagram at maybemindful. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please give me a follow, screenshot the episode, and go ahead and tag me until next week when I bring you another thought-provoking and inspiring topic. Until then,